Yeah.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's
Just sit
talk.
and
Hopefully, yeah, this is on. Right, great. My name's David Savage. I am, this is an incredibly silly job title, but the Group Technology Evangelist at the Harvey Nash Group. I also run a podcast called Tech Talks. I'm joined by a panel who really can speak about the future of AI. I feel like I should feel a bit like James Corden probably should have felt during the Friends reunion, very much as a room filler. But we've got 40 minutes to talk about the future of AI. And if we could start just with a very quick introduction to you each. We'll come arbitrarily along the line. Charlie, sorry to start with you.
no problem.
But if you could just tell everyone who you are, what you do, and very quickly what your definition of AI is, and try and keep that short, because I appreciate that could go on.
Absolutely. So hi everyone, very excited to be here. My name is Charlie Beveridge. I come with a couple of hats. I am currently running my own independent consulting company for startups. Startups that are around Series C, generally translating complex technical AI concepts into business language. And I'm also in parallel working on building a product in the debiasing AI space. And to me, AI is the ability to learn automatically.
Thank you. So Simon Asplund Taylor, I am a serial chief data officer. So I've tended to do interim roles, going in, fixing, setting up data capabilities for organizations. So just finished a role at Lloyd's of London, building out their data capabilities and putting in place the strategy for the insurance marketplace. And so part of that was kind of looking at all the data capabilities in AI and machine learning, where we're going to get to, and then previously having done similar things for Tesco's and Rackspace, and so being a consultant and being on the other side. My definition of AI is, it's so diverse, and I'm sure we're going to get onto that later with some of the questions, but it really is about doing the things that you can't do as a human being in a way that's automated and smart, and I know we'll get onto that later. So.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophia. I'm a senior data scientist at Sky. I'm also a visiting researcher at King's College London. Prior to working at Sky, I've worked at a couple of startups doing data science and machine learning research. Before that, I was doing a PhD in academia. So my definition of AI would be algorithms and essentially artificial ways of machines making complex decisions that we would describe as intelligent, tasks that are specific and quite difficult sometimes, or tasks that can be quite general. That's me.
Cool. Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Chris Spragley. I'm a principal developer advocate at AWS. So I'm more so these days on like the infrastructure side, ML ops, and just being able to get the models out quickly and to test them live in production. Formerly Netflix, I was part of the original streaming team, so you can all thank me later for the entertainment during COVID. And then Databricks, who's a big sponsor here, and then moved to AWS. So definition of AI, I guess, is similar to like your answer about algorithms. And I spend a lot of time, coming from Databricks and coming from Netflix. We had a lot of data, and so I think a lot of my answers today will probably end up back in the data space and kind of wrangling all that data. And then, just making sense of it.
Well, look, the panel is called The Future of AI. I thought we'd start with the very near future, and Sophia, I'll come to you first, but Chris, given what you said there about infrastructure, you might have an opinion too, but there has been this acceleration of digital adoption in the pandemic. A lot of organizations who previously hadn't really considered digital strategies, investing heavily in cloud and infrastructure in particular, but that may well lead to unstructured data that might not be that helpful for the adoption of AI 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Do you think the pandemic has been good for an adoption of AI?
I think it was always going to be more and more adopted as AI becomes a trend and something that more and more companies want to get involved with more and more data. I think possibly in some sectors it might have accelerated it. And I think it's probably a good thing to have the infrastructure in place. I think you probably need to have teams of people who are also thinking about what data they want to collect, making a plan for that collection, for the kinds of applications they're wanting to use in the future. Because obviously if you don't have the data, you can't solve the problems that you need with that data. So yeah, collect lots of data, be thoughtful about it, and if it is unstructured, think about how you would then apply that to the kinds of problems you're going to be facing in the future. Yeah.
I mean, Chris, Netflix and AWS, huge amounts of data, probably
Yeah.
very well structured, but you must talk to colleagues in other organizations who've got that infrastructure in place but maybe hadn't thought this through. A rapid adoption.
Yeah. I haven't really thought too much about the COVID part of it. The first thing that popped into my mind is this new trend towards feature stores. Yeah, so not sure if you've seen any talks on this. There's not too much out there online right now, but there's some companies in like San Francisco where I live that are focused on this. And yes, AWS has feature stores. The cool thing is that you can actually back up in time, so you can do time travel. And so feature stores would be, you would transform your data, if it's tabular, if it's image, if it's like language, stored in the feature store with a timestamp and say, these are the features as of now. And what I'm starting to see is, now that things are starting to recover, people are starting to watch movies again at the same, or at the 2019 pace, and not all day, like 24 hours a day like we've been doing. These feature stores are coming in handy because we can back up and start to model as of 2019 and before versus these more recent patterns. So yeah, that's one of the trends I've seen.
Simon, if I come to you, I sometimes wonder if we're slightly guilty of talking about AI and these technologies from the perspective of organizations who are reasonably digitally mature. So it's worth kind of considering perhaps there are some obstacles that we forget when it comes to the initial implementation of AI and what some of those hurdles might be.
Yeah, I can think of several. I think you do assume that you've got the data sets in place. And I think that's a massive assumption, right? So I think everyone has these, AI, and if you talk to your CEO, and it's kind of, my usual thing, you go and have that discussion, and they say, I want this shiny toy. We're all used to that. And then the next thing they think is, you can just go do it. And actually, the underlying assumption for me is that the more shiny toys there are, the more it stretches your capability for data engineering, for all your skills and capabilities. So the first thing is, yes, it's all possible at some point, but actually you need to start small. So my view is, you start off with some sort of AI, machine learning, maturity model. You do some really simple things which are low risk and low risk to the organization. They're things that maybe spotting faults in things. And if you spot a fault, that's good news, because whereas if you're automating something that's really complex decision making and you try using AI to do that without anyone involved, you don't know whether you've got bias, you don't know whether you've thought it through properly, and it may be making massive decisions. So I'm thinking investment banking, algorithms to trade, because you're close to your exchange, very low latency, using AI to make decisions ahead of the competition, that's a real challenge and quite a risk. So using fault detection, so starting small, getting people up to speed, getting your skills, processes, tooling in place, doing some simple things, proving it, and then gradually maturing and do more things which go up the risk, but also the value ladder as well. So with greater risk, you get greater value, I guess.
And you're there talking about large investment banks perhaps, or large legacy organizations. I mean, Charlie, you're dealing with startups. Is it the same issues? Or I suppose there's that greenfield aspect to a startup where maybe they don't have some of the challenges.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking, whilst I agree with you, Simon, I think there is a trend in AI to try and reduce as much as possible so that something is possible. And in reality, if you're trying to make a decision, generally there is a lot of context that a human would use to make a decision. And so if you've reduced your AI engine to use such a small data set that is feasible to collate and to manage and to ensure the quality is up there, often what the AI spits out in terms of the decision doesn't feel right because it hasn't actually been enabled with the right context. So for me, I think the way to kind of manage both sides is to say it's not about quantity of data, it's not about kind of the variety of different features you're using, it's about the connections between your data and how you might be able to say, right, this particular feature matters only in these instances, or these connections over here are creating this context that mean that there would be a trump card at one particular point. And for me, that kind of it balances the best of both worlds. Yeah. And I think back to the kind of startup versus the enterprise space, I would actually say that startups are actually enabled by what is happening in the enterprise space. I think AWS and GCP and Azure are encouraging kind of major organizations to pull all of their data into the cloud and to structure it and to get data governance processes into place. And that just means then that the playing field is right for startups to come in and use that data and do some really cool stuff with it and kind of create amazing business outcomes that were never before possible.
Just quickly before we move on, I mean, there's a mention there of tools to help stretch capability. Any tools that any of you have heard of perhaps that might help implement AI?
What was the start of the question, sorry?
Well, we've talked a bit about tooling. I just wondered you hear about kind of drag and drop kind of tooling and stuff. Is there anything that people have come across?
Definitely, you'll have a lot to say. I mean, like AWS, we use AWS as our cloud service provider for our part of the organization in innovation AI, and like there's lots of kind of black box, if you like, ML algorithms you can use that can help like small and large companies apply machine learning. So for example, there's like AWS Personalize or services like this which enable you to basically build personalization models or like other things and without a lot of prior knowledge in data science necessarily. You can just have like an engineering team basically implement these models. So I think there's a lot of stuff out there that can kind of help you plug and play quickly, iterate, and then see what you like, what works for the company. They can be useful, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, 40 minutes of you sitting here would be quite dull. Before we move on, has anyone got any questions at this point? I mean, it's after lunchtime. Yeah, here's one. Sorry, have we got a microphone that we could... Sorry. I think there's a mic at the back of the room.
Yeah.
Here we go. Sorry, you had a question, sir.
Hi there, yeah. You talk a lot about the large enterprise, AWS and financial banks and your startups. How do you think adoption of AI is for the medium ground, your small enterprises, your large businesses, who it's not greenfield because they already have a well-established data platform, but don't necessarily have the resources or the input or knowledge in the business that a large enterprise may do? Do you have any tips, recommendations, or just thoughts or ideas there?
Simon, perhaps you...
Yeah, I have one, I think. So it was really interesting to think about, large organizations, and Charlie talking about startups. So I think it's fair to say that for startups that have that mentality of, and I'm just thinking in the insurance market, we were trying to say to 1,000 participants, go out there and make some change. And there are some firms who are starting up and they are pure AI based. They are startups and they are the most successful because that's their mindset. I think with large corporations, they can invest, but with the medium-sized ones, I think it's about, it's so complex because you've got to have the skills, you've got to have the environment, you've got to have the business case, you've got to have people understanding what you can do it. So actually, the way that people have been successful is just going outside to do that, getting that sort of, finding something that's already been done, and then using that as your business case to say, we've done it. Because if you start off by thinking about your data, the environment, building out the tool sets, you have so many decisions to make, actually you're going to fall over on the way. But it's about finding a partner, and we were talking about this earlier, sort of large consulting firms versus boutique, consulting firms. find someone who gets your, gets your business, who can help you, who will then be able to bring some domain knowledge as well. Otherwise, you're training them in your domain, and they go off and exploit it. So I would say, find someone who's close to you, go do that, and then if it works, make sure you adopt the knowledge and they don't go and take it away and take your IP away.
And the other thing that SMB has in its favor is, I mean, oftentimes I think it's political, how difficult it is to pull data together and implement systems and get the right outcomes. And in SMB, you don't have as many people as you do in enterprise. And so whilst you might have your standard BSS and OSS stack that you've got to try and pull together and make work, you actually have fewer people to sign off. And so I would have thought, yeah, you have that advantage.
Bias got mentioned earlier. Charlie, it's obviously still an issue regarding AI. Surely by now we should have found some solutions to try and meet this challenge.
We should have. So I guess we all know, the problem with bias is that it is a structural disadvantage, systemic problem with society that algorithms are reflecting in the decisions that they make. And the tools that do exist today, open source and offered by the major clouds, generally use their anchor point as protected characteristics. So they say, based on ethnicity or sexuality or gender, let's make sure that there aren't different treatments in the output of this tool. Whereas in reality, in society, the lived experience of individuals is really more based on the disadvantage or the advantage that they're experiencing, which may or may not be aligned to some extent with their protected characteristics. And so what I'm kind of focused on at the moment is how could we build something that mitigates the disadvantage or the advantage that people are experiencing, as opposed to just arbitrarily assuming that everyone of the same protected group has exactly the same lived experience. And it's a really interesting space.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really interesting point. I hope you don't mind me just jumping in there.
No, go for it. This is better when we get a bit of conversation going.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I think it depends also on what your algorithm's trying to do. So definitely it can be a problem for when your algorithm is literally replicating human decisions. So your training data is literally a decision that was made by a human previously. So for example, if you had a group of people and you were saying which should be allowed to interview, and you were using an ML model to make that prediction based on historical human decisions that have been made, of course that's going to be embedded, that bias is going to be embedded within the model. But I also think it's also within the data, so sometimes it might be a bit, it might not be that obvious. It might be that you could use a feature like gender, for example, to predict certain outcomes of what people watch, and it might be that certain groups do tend to go to certain types of content, and so then you've got to kind of think more cleverly about what your model is actually doing with the data that it's trained on. So I think it can kind of, from a technical point of view and implementation point of view, I think it depends on the problem you're trying to solve. Like, is it a human decision that you're replicating essentially, or is it in the data somehow, and do you need to be quite thoughtful about your data? And there are different techniques out there, but I think you've got to adopt it from the bottom up as well as the top down. As data scientists working on it every day, you've got to be thoughtful about these problems as well.
Absolutely, go on, Chris.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that as we use more and more pre-trained models, right, like BERT for like natural language, there's other like computer vision, there are biases, right, that are in these models. So no matter what your data, if it's biased or if it's totally balanced, these pre-trained models do have bias in them. And these are open source models trained on human language over the last 50, 100 years where there is bias. So I think the best you can do is at least detect it and try to work around it. And so, so for example, AWS has this open source library called Clarify, which is also a managed service that can help you to detect. And I can't talk about, like too much about the roadmap, but yes, as you can imagine, this is a very hot topic, and we do have a big conference coming up in December, and there will likely be some more advancements in the like detection of the bias. Now, solving bias, yes, that's a whole nother topic, and that's not something that one tool can do or one service can do, but the ability to detect it in the like pre-trained models also is very important.
I'm going to go into slightly dodgy territory here because I have a politics degree, whereas you have a PhD. And Simon, your data IQ is most 100 influential people in data. So asking a slightly more technical question is risky ground for me. But increasingly I'm hearing people talk about explainability in AI, and it seems linked. If machines are beginning to determine which data is relevant, that can only perhaps entrench bias issues. Simon, when you're talking to the organisations that you're talking to, are they aware of explainability? Are they dealing with it?
Well, I go back to the earlier thing. You'll never solve bias, okay? That's just I'll put it out there. It's just, unless you understand every type of bias, you'll never be able to fix it. And I don't think we do. There's explicit bias. We're aware of those things. But actually there's implied bias, where you look at certain things and you go, well, based on the inputs we've got from the data we collected historically, you absolutely know there's bias in that, because those systems might go back 30, 40 years. I only have to talk to my 90-year-old mother about stuff and understand the bias she's got. And that makes me freak, and yet my children, I've got 3 boys, and they might talk about my bias and stuff. So that generational stuff changes. We are all becoming far more aware of it, which is great, but you cannot go back unless it's a bit like a data quality problem. Going back and fixing data quality issues is hard work. Okay, it's very difficult to do. Yes, we can use AI to do that. Going back and fixing bias from data that's collected years ago is really difficult to do. And we've developed products and services, and most of those have some sort of implied bias in them alone. So if the only data you collect is from people who can use keyboards, you've got implied bias already. So I think it's impossible to solve, but I think what we are doing is becoming more aware of it, and it is a little bit about having the right people with the right awareness to then go back and inform people to improve things.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I agree you can't solve it based on the data sets that exist already, but I do think that there is a lot of hope in new data sets that you introduce into the mix. And so if you take an example of 2 candidates that are applying to university, and both of them have got the same exam results, the same interview score. So on paper they look the same, right? But one of them has had really good education. They've had really good training. They've been through interview training. They've got access to educated adults. They're just really well prepped. They've got a lot of advantage. The other person has had a bad education by all accounts. They've cared for someone, so they don't have extra time to study in, and so they've had a lot of disadvantage. In that scenario, there is context there where if you collate that as data and you input it into your model, actually you have a completely different perspective on whether those 2 candidates are equal or not.
Yeah.
So on the basis of the data that exists in the application system and in that algorithm that's making that assessment, sure, you can't solve the bias because that's all you can see, the same score and the same interview result. But on the basis of the new data around that disadvantage, you absolutely can make a decision.
Yeah, I think also just coming back to the explainable AI topic, as in I think there are lots of really good tools out there, open source. There's like Lime and Shap and things like this that help you understand why a very complex deep learning model, which is highly nonlinear, making these decisions that are not explainable. In fact, why it's so intelligent is that it's not explainable. But it can help you sort of understand why those decisions are made based on the context or the data that's supplied. So kind of relates to what you're saying about what is the context of this decision out of all these inputs which are contributing to this output. So I definitely recommend basically if you're building any kind of product that interacts with customers that uses ML in the back end, do explore these techniques, because it is really, and also, sort of for your stakeholders and product people, they're often like, why is it making this decision? Why am I getting recommended this? Why am I getting that? And of course, it would be good to understand that more and more. So there are techniques out there. So, use them and look into. Yeah, definitely, I would encourage people to use them. So.
Chris mentioned it was a hot topic. Before we move on, are there any questions on this? Because, yes, we've got a question at the back.
I have another question, but I'll start with this one. Just on this topic about bias and things like that, we have the European Union about to introduce regulation around the AI market, so I just was interested to get your opinion on what you're thinking about that at the moment.
Who fancies fielding that?
I can make
Yeah.
a stab. I think the proof is in the pudding, in all honesty. The draft legislation is available. We don't yet know in practice how that is going to play out. The threat of a 6% GDP fine is pretty major, and if you look at the kinds of results that businesses put in for GDPR type purposes, you could expect that maybe it will have an impact, but there are people that suggest that it doesn't go far enough yet in kind of the level of strictness in the wording, but as is with the law, I think, we'll only really see as it plays out and as decisions are made.
Any other questions at this point? Yeah, sorry, one down the front here.
Also on the topic of bias, I think there is so more than just the data being biased. It's also the question, how do we translate the data into models afterwards, right? Because the thing that we are applying to real world situations at the end isn't the data, it's the model that we build. So the idea is, how do we want to cement in the biases that the data has into our model? And there are works where people have looked into trying to build, into either building models, replicating the biases, or building models where we can have the same outcomes and better predictive outcomes whilst not replicating the biases that we have in the past data. So I think we really have to distinguish between biased data and biased models here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I
Quick comment on that before we move on.
So I think there are several roles. I'm not sure there's quite the technology around solving that problem, but I think, alongside having AI and ML, you need people who will understand the context, as you were talking about. What's the context of how that model is being used, to understand what are the guidelines for those things. And I think that comes back to ethics. In my mind, it's ethics being much broader. So you look at that and start saying what's the right thing to do, and then having an explainer afterwards. And I know we were sort of, it's one of those things where someone says, we said we were going to do that. Is that what we did? And what was the impact? So I think it's about having people alongside the tooling to just validate and check, and people who have got the right mental sort of approach to the problem, which isn't, that's great, it's solved, but actually will question it, rip it apart, and try and make sure that we do everything possible. So.
Sorry, we had one more quick question, Jen, and glasses down the front, and then we'll move on. Thank you.
Hi. It's on a new topic, which if that fits. I'm very interested in the environmental impacts of AI. There's been interesting research on this suggesting that it could be possible to achieve nearly as much with rather less power usage from AI ML models, particularly for organisations that are aiming for net zero. I appreciate it's at least one on the panel. Does that mean changes to achieve green AI?
So you've stolen my next question,
Sorry.
which is brilliant. You've asked it probably better than I can. I was just going to ask, can AI be green, and throw it towards Sophia?
Yeah, I think there are definitely, this is definitely a field in research that is becoming more and more of a hot topic. You can have, especially with natural language processing models like BERT and other models that have just been trained on, like the entirety of the internet. Basically, you can't always do that every time you want to fine-tune that for a particular task of your interest. And it has been a kind of growing field, and sort of since BERT was created, there's been kind of like an active research field into looking at, okay, so this is a great model with all these parameters. How do we essentially reduce the computation that's required to get a similar output. And so there's been other models like Distilbert, which have similar performance or very good performance, but use much less power to train essentially. So I'm hopeful that will continue as a trend and an active area of research, because I think all these models tend to be quite open source, which then industry will use. So if they're out there already in the R&D phase, they'll be used by industry. So I think it is a problem, and I think people are focused on it within research. That like the active research community is very interested in this. So I think if that continues, we'll be in a good place, because industry applies the research that's created essentially.
There does seem to be a slight kind of discrepancy in the best way forward with this. I was at a conference just a couple of weeks ago where one organisation was talking about keeping data sets small and flexible versus another organisation, an infrastructure organisation, saying, hey, come and put all of your data in the Nordics because it's cheap and it's green. And it's just, I don't know, Chris, you're smiling at the end. I mean, I assume AWS have a line on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of like sustainability efforts going on. Yeah, so back to your point about like distillation, which is this, it's a like statistical method, teacher-student. So you have this huge BERT model, for example, that's been trained on millions and has like billions of parameters, and you want to get that model down, obviously, in size, so you could use smaller compute. So you would use distillation, which it like gives you about 97% of the accuracy, but it's down, I think, 66 million parameters versus billions of parameters. So you can fit it into smaller GPUs, smaller CPUs. The other techniques that like pop into my head are like pruning, where you have these deep neural networks and pruning, so just the most significant parts. And so there's a lot of like research going on there, and ways to actually sort of hyperparameter tune your pruning. So you would try one set of pruning and then push it out into production, and then make sure that the accuracy stays pretty high. So yeah, like a lot of like different levels of the green factor.
Any other comments on sustainable thread?
Do you have any? No, okay. I think there's software ways of doing it. I mean, you guys know much better than I do. There's hardware ways of doing it. So the move to quantum computing maybe will make a big difference, except for the refrigeration energy. I think ultimately we have to change our mindset with the way that we use AI. We have to be. It's not about just more data is better, like bigger. If we have an issue, just throw more data at it and it will learn more and faster and so on. It's about what's the most efficient, cheapest, fastest way to learn this. And if you think about a human brain and the way that we don't need to see like a million chairs to know that the next thing is a chair. We just know that it's a chair when we've seen a handful of them. And how do we do that? Like, why is that so different to the way that image processing is working? And there's a great guy called David Cox who works at the IBM MIT AI Research Lab who explains neurosymbolic AI really well. And so the using more context about the features that you're creating. So things like, right, a chair generally sits on the floor and you sit on it and it has legs and it has a back sometimes, and those sorts of things help you much more than just the look of it and the pixels in a picture. And so yeah, it's just about being cleverer and smarter about the way that you're pulling it all together.
Just to stick with you for a second, because you mentioned earlier about startups being enabled by AWS, etc. Thinking about how AI might change the shape of the tech sector moving forward, is there a slight concern that AI gives such a big advantage to big tech in terms of the data sets they've got access to?
Yeah, I think, so there's this, I forget what it's called, like the start problem, where if you don't have a massive data set, it's really hard to get started with AI, and so startups, so you have to overcome that. Equally, the big AI companies are providing so many free, democratically available modules that startups don't have to go and create from ground zero every single time. They can reuse the modules they need to use. And actually, so the start problem not from a data perspective, but from a kind of infrastructure perspective is no longer there. It's amazing. It swings and roundabouts, really. I'm undecided.
And one thing that I did want to ask as well, and you all might have a view on this, but Simon, if I ask you first of all, coming back to one of the kind of the initial main questions, if anyone in the audience is considering adopting AI, what piece of advice would you give them at the start of that journey?
Yeah, I think that comes back to that whole thing of size of organisation. So are you a startup? And I think it's a very different perspective. And if I look at the insurance market recently, the small startups that are AI based, they've gone out with a very clear purpose, and they know how AI is going to work for them. So I think that makes success far more likely. So I think having that business purpose and then knowing that you can use AI and it will give you some value. I think that's the first thing, is to go back to what business problem you're solving. I think if you're a middle-sized organization, we've talked about that a little bit, about, so try and get someone else who's done something similar, bring it in. But actually, if you're a large corporation, I think it's much more challenging. I think it's much more challenging because you've got so much dead wood around in terms of data and capabilities and everything else. So I think go back to the business case and have something aligned to knowing you can get an outcome with AI. Because if it's not aligned, then I think people will say, why have you done it? But keep it experimental. So that's the only other thing I'd say, is don't try and promise that AI will fully automate things, productionize things. Be experimental and demonstrate that it is an experiment. Data science, by definition, is an experiment. Do it in an experimental way and build on it and grow.
Is there the latitude to be experimental at Sky, at AWS still?
I think definitely in enterprise it can be difficult to innovate. That's kind of the benefit of startups. But I think I'm quite fortunate. I'm within Innovation AI, so that's our whole purpose, is to innovate and try things out, and we can be more risky. We can afford to be more risky. I think, with adoption and everything, it will, you've just got to think about, do you have the expertise in-house? And also, I completely agree. Focus on the business problem. There's like a joke in ML, like, when you think you've got you've got an ML problem, well, what's the first question you ask? It's, do we need to use ML? It's actually like, focus on those business problems first, because essentially machine learning is just a tool, and there's lots of other really cool tools out there that can help you solve business problems. So just be focused on your business problem, and it might be like a tool that can help you solve it, essentially.
Probably got time for one more quick question. Sorry, there's one down the front. Sorry if anyone else put their hands up, but a big room to scan.
Okay, thank you. If I can very quickly ask for a show of hands from the panel, how many of you think that, let's say, in the next 30 years, we will see the creation of an AI that can outsmart any and every human being?
Are you waiting to go first, or is that no one thinks that?
We're not a hopeful panel, are we?
Thank you. Look, that brings us to the end of the session. I know the future of AI is a very broad topic, so thank you for bearing with us, and thanks for coming along to the session. Thank you, Charlie, Simon, Sophia, and Chris, for your thoughts.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.